My kid's struggling with anxiety. How can I help them deal better with anxiety? It's something that many parents have asked me over the years. So if you've ever had that thought, then stay tuned as I share 3 top tips for parents so they can more effectively help their children to deal with anxiety without simply saying, it'll be okay. And by the way, these 3 tips can also help adults who are struggling with anxiety too. My name's Howard Cooper. I'm an ex-anxiety sufferer who's now spent over 20 years helping both adults and children to beat anxiety for good, and I'm also a father of 2 young kids. This channel is all about giving you real-world, tried and tested anxiety-beating strategies without simply telling people to take deep breaths, think positive or distract themselves. If you like the sound of that, then click subscribe and follow me on this journey of helping people to become free from anxiety for good. And also a big thank you to Vicky Rose at All About Babies, who inspired this video. All About Babies do great work to help parents sleep train and wean their newborns, and even run antenatal groups too. But given that they've been going for so long and helped so many, these babies are now getting older and becoming kids. So Vicky thought it would be useful to share some tips with these parents to help their kids. Now, before we dive into the 3 tips, I do want to take a moment to share what is arguably the most important message of this video. Children can feel anxious from time to time, and that's okay. Feeling a little worried, anxious or fearful about things is a normal developmental occurrence, and allowing them some space and time to work through these things and develop their own resilience should be the goal. I say this because I fear that sometimes as parents we can have a knee-jerk response to our children getting upset and want to immediately solve it or take them out of discomfort. But think of it like this. I'll often get calls from parents who say, my child has just started getting anxious about something. Can we book a session for them ASAP for you to help them deal with this anxiety? Well, even if I could just magic the anxiety away for them, what really would the child have learned from this interaction? The moment I get anxious, my parents go into panic about it and take me to someone else to get rid of it. They learn that anxiety in and of itself is to be feared, and that when it occurs, mum or dad take them to someone else who gets rid of it. What they haven't learned is that anxiety can be normal, and how to develop self-efficacy to take responsibility for their own thinking. So even magicking the anxiety away for them would be simply winning the battle, but losing the war. So the tips I'm about to share are really all about helping our kids develop their own anxiety-beating skills and increased resilience, not just taking them somewhere to be fixed. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far and it's making you think, then this would be a great time to give the video a like, because that tells YouTube this is a message worth sharing more widely. Let's dive in. Top tip number 1, navigating their own sense of safety. I can't sleep, I'm too afraid of fire, my 5-year-old said, and this fear seemed to go on for a while despite me saying it'll be alright, there's nothing to be afraid of, it'll be okay. However, I suddenly stopped and realised that I wasn't handling this in a very sensible way. Fire can be dangerous, and telling them it'll be okay, there's nothing to worry about, in relation to fire, doesn't seem like a very sensible idea. So one night after he'd gone down to bed and I was downstairs sorting dinner, my son started screaming again, Daddy, Daddy, I'm scared of fire. So this time I went up and said, you know what? You're right. Fire is dangerous. And you should have seen his little face. His eyes went wide. What? But I had his attention. I went on, fire can be dangerous, so let me show you how we stay safe. And I showed him the smoke detectors in the house, showed him what they sound like when they go off, and explained that they kept us safe, and that if no alarms were sounding, it means we are safe from fire. So what happened? Well, over the next week, he would call me upstairs and say, I'm scared of fire. And I'd say, shh, what can you hear? And he'd reply, nothing. And then I'd say, right, so what does that mean? And he'd stop and think and reply, I'm safe. After a few days of this, he stopped calling me upstairs in terror, as he was able to check for the alarm sound himself and know that he was safe. In other words, rather than just telling him platitudes like, don't worry about it, I taught him to navigate his own sense of safety, so he could deal with anxiety better for himself. So tip 1 is acknowledge the validity of their fear, but explore ways in which they can know how to keep themselves safe. Side note, notice that when I went up to my screaming son after showing him the fire alarm, I didn't say, the fire alarm isn't going off, so that means you're safe. I asked him the questions. What can you hear?
What does the fact that you can't hear anything mean? In other words, I was encouraging him to make those mental connections for himself, rather than just me telling them.
Top tip number 2. Thoughts are not facts. When I was the lead presenter with Virgin Atlantic on their Flying Without Fear course, I used to start out by saying, I don't believe that anyone here is actually afraid of flying. At this point, of course, there was a lot of head scratching and people looking at me like I'd lost the plot, likely thinking to themselves, don't be ridiculous. Of course I'm afraid of flying. Why else did I come on a Fear of Flying course? At this point, I'd say, I'll prove it to you. Who here, when you think about flying, feels anxious? And of course, all the hands in the room would go up. At which point I'd say, right, look around the room and realise that right now we are on the ground in a conference centre. You're not on a plane, you're not flying. Which means if you can feel anxious about flying and you aren't actually flying, then it can't be the flying that's giving you anxiety. Instead, it's your thoughts about it.
In other words, people are scaring themselves with some mental images or internal dialogue that they are forgetting are just thoughts. If you can help your child to understand this, and to understand that thoughts in and of themselves really don't pose a threat, it can be incredibly helpful for them. So, how do you go about doing this? Well, let me give you an example of working with a child who was terrified of dogs.
I asked them, when you think about dogs, how do you feel? Scared, they replied. Okay, so if you can feel scared right now and there isn't actually a dog here, it can't be a real dog making you anxious, can it? So what are you imagining right now that means you're scaring yourself?
Notice how I'm shifting the language to be around how are they scaring themselves, not how do dogs scare you.
I'm imagining a big scary dog. Right, okay.
Now at this point I like to tell kids the story about the creation of cinema and how back in 1986 when the people of France were shown a 90-second film of a train pulling into a station, they got so scared they ran out the cinema screaming because they thought it was real, the train that they were seeing. Now if you ham that story up as well, they often really love that and laugh at just how ridiculous it was that they thought it was real.
You wouldn't have fallen for that, would you? They emphatically shook their head. So let me show you a picture now, and I showed them a picture of a tiger, screamed, started hiding behind the chair in my office.
At this point the kid starts laughing and clearly thinks I'm crazy.
Why are you laughing at me? I asked. It's not a real tiger, it's just a picture.
Phew.
So then I play around with this and see if I can get them to make a mental image in their mind of tiger. And when they nod and confirm it's there, I say, stop! Don't think about it anymore! I don't want that tiger in your mind to eat you! Save yourself!
And again they looked at me like I was nuts and said, it's just a picture in my head, it's not real. This is exactly what we want. Can you, through experiences, coaching and questions, get your kids adamant about the fact that the images in their heads aren't real? So now I just began to get them to explore how the thought dog in their mind also isn't real. As you slowly guide them in this way, you are literally teaching children to change two things. One, to begin to see that it's not stuff on the outside that's causing their anxiety, but simply some thoughts they had interpreted as scary. And two, you're helping children to understand that thoughts aren't facts and aren't a threat. They aren't real. Far more effective than just saying, it will be okay.
Top tip number 3, creating a silly story. This is a fantastic approach that kids really love and also has the benefit of training their brains to think differently. Often the reason kids get anxious, as you now know, is that they get hung up on some scary thought, but not only that, they likely get caught up on that one thought. Think of it like a record player and the needle getting caught in a scratch in the record and playing the same horrible bar of music over and over again. In this case, it's like the something bad is going to happen bit of music.
Something bad is going to happen, something bad is going to happen, something bad is going to happen.
But in reality, the song doesn't end. The story doesn't end there. But in their mind, the movie is stuck in the groove of that bad part.
Imagine watching a film and at the climax of the film, when everything looks like it's going wrong for the protagonist, and they're bound not to escape or overcome what appears to be insurmountable odds, the film just ended and repeated over and over at the most dramatic bit. Wouldn't be a great film, but it also wouldn't be an accurate representation of the whole story.
So this is a silly story game where essentially you help your child to take their thinking out of the unhelpful record notch it's caught in. I call it the silly story game. Original name, I know. Once they're beginning to see that it's just their thinking that's scaring themselves, I say, what are you really scared of? And they tell me, for example, the plane crashing.
Okay, great, let's begin. And I say, start a story with that thought. Once upon a time,
the plane I was on crashed.
And now I add a sentence. Into a sea of green lime jelly. Where? And then I invite them to continue the story and to do so in the silliest and craziest ways possible.
They ate the jelly up, and then they got so hungry, they ate the plane up too.
I take it a little way until usually they're laughing, and then we say, let's go again. Only this time I go first. Once upon a time, the plane I was on crashed and then I let them go next, with encouragement to come up with sillier and even more absurd funny tales.
Not only do they enjoy this, but it also encourages their brain to start looking forward to increasingly funny and absurd, unbelievable ways to take that old scary thought out of that groove. In other words, it teaches the brain a pattern of going from anxiety to fun and disbelief and silliness.
So these are the 3 practical tips I wanted to share with you today, but I do have a huge caveat as well to point out, and I apologise in advance if this ruffles your feathers, but I need to mention this as an important truth. Children learn by modelling us, by watching how we interact in the world and then mirroring, matching and copying that stuff. If every time they get anxious, you start getting really anxious about your child struggling with anxiety, they're likely to pick up on that. It will likely make things worse. If you have a tendency towards getting stressed out and anxious about stuff, then don't just try and help your kids to deal better with anxiety. Start with sorting out your own stuff too.
Now, I do need to remind you that I do work with people one-on-one and children as well, normally 10 plus when it's appropriate. But to help parents begin to have these conversations with younger ones, I wanted to find a way of helping begin that conversation around anxiety, fears and worries with them in a way that they enjoy and understand. So I wrote a book, specially to help 4 to 9 year olds understand how sometimes we can become afraid of things that actually pose no threat, like our thoughts. It's called The Rustle of Leaves. It's available on Amazon right now. Link below, beautifully illustrated by an amazingly talented guy called Jacob Rosier. And at the back of the book, I've included some further follow-up questions to help your children pull out the themes of the book and begin to challenge their own thinking. I have an early version of the story, it's changed a little since then, on my YouTube channel as a live reading too.
By the way, after you get hold of a copy from Amazon, I'd hugely appreciate a positive Amazon review, as I would love to tempt more parents into helping their kids get their heads around this important topic.
As always, hope you've enjoyed the video. Like, comment below, let me know how you got on with it. Be well and all the best.